everybody.
So welcome everyone to today's HFES webinar. Today's session is the impact of COVID-19 on child education and equity, and this is a part of the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion webinar series around listening and acting being hosted by HFES this year. My name is Alexis Kolak. I'm the Education Manager for HFES, and it's my pleasure to be your organizer for today. Before I turn things over to our moderator and panelists, just a few quick housekeeping items. During today's broadcast, all attendees will be on mute for the duration. However, if you do have questions for our panelists, you can use the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar to submit those questions. Karen will be helping us to moderate those as they come in, and we will answer those questions as we move further into the presentation. If you need technical assistance during today's session, you can also use that Q&A feature and I'll be happy to assist you with that. And then finally, at the close of today's session, we will be archiving a recording of this. So if you need to go back and revisit any key points or share this with a colleague, it will be available to you via HFES and we'll let you know when that recording is available. At this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to Karen Jacobs for introductions and welcome, Karen.
Thank you and welcome everybody. I'm Karen Jacobs. I'm the Outreach Division Chairperson for the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, and I'll be your moderator for today. We have a wonderful session in store for you, so thanks for joining us. This webinar is part of the HFES Listening and Acting webinar series, and this specific seminar webinar is focused on really important issues that are experienced by communities, parents, and children that are at the intersection of the pandemic, childhood education, pre-K through 12th grade, social disparities, and the potential overlap with human factors and ergonomics. So I'd like to introduce our three speakers today. I'll start with Dr. Barrett. Dr. Barrett has been passionate as an educator for more than 25 years, serving in a variety of instructional and leadership roles, both at a district, state, and corporate levels. She currently serves as the Florida A&M Minority University Research in NASA and in education as the program manager. She also concurrently is an educational consultant in the private sector. So I want to welcome you, Dr. Barrett. So let's also introduce our other speakers today too. Dr. Crump has been serving her life's passion in the education arena for 25 years also, on all levels, state, district, and local. She is the current director of neglected and delinquent programs funded under Title I Part D grant for Leon County School District, and that's located in Tallahassee, Florida. So welcome. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Patel, who's an associate professor of human development and family science in the College of Education and Human Ecology. And her research centers on understanding how contextual factors shape health and development among low-income children, and how policies and programs can enhance the development of the trajectory of these youth. So we're going to actually start off with Dr. Patel. And how we'll structure this webinar is that I'll be asking each of our panelists some questions. They'll respond and they'll have about 12 minutes or so to respond to the questions. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So let's start. So I want to just begin by setting the stage that human factors is about design and the premise that design influences performance for better or for worse. And tools and systems that are well designed meet people's needs and help them achieve their goals. So, Dr. Patel, let me ask you the first question. And just to set the stage again, we're going to look at the different age groups with our speakers. So at a pre-K level, what are the top two greatest needs that you see a student has and that an educational system needs to provide to a student at that age?
Thanks for the question, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm excited to have the opportunity to talk with you all. Um, Thinking about pre-K, we often think about the year before kindergarten, which is usually around age 5. But I want to talk a little bit about the whole birth to 5 continuum to get started. So we know that children's brains are built from the bottom up, and these early years are of critical importance. It's a time of rapid neuron development and connection forming. And research has shown that the experiences children have in this time shape the development for their entire life. And so when I think about what it is that children need during this time, there's really a few basic experiences that we know promote positive development. The first is safety and security. So thinking about a child in a classroom, they need to be safe. Anyone who's been around a 3-year-old knows how easy it is for them to find themselves in trouble. And so designing environments that are going to prevent injury is the key component. But there's also this aspect of security. Kids need to feel safe in their environment, both from a physical but also an emotional standpoint, having consistent positive interactions with their teachers and with the peers around them. The second is the opportunity for learning experiences. So having a program that provides rich language and conversation for kids to experience, that allows children to interact with new materials and see principles like cause and effect play out in their behaviors, and really provide aligned learning experiences that build upon one another across the school year. And lastly, an early childcare program or a preschool wants to be sure to avoid toxic stress. So toxic stress is the idea of stressors that people experience that are above and beyond normal day-to-day stress. So this might be experiences with abuse and neglect. It could also be experiences such as having hunger or lots of conflict occurring in the home. And so at a minimum, our early educational systems need to not be introducing toxic stress into children's lives. But ideally what they're doing is connecting with parents and families to make sure that parents have what they need and are connected to the services that they need to reduce the likelihood of toxic stress occurring in the home.
You know, it's very interesting about toxic stress. I hadn't thought of it in the definition that you've provided, and I'm so glad that you did provide that definition for us. So my next question is, are there demographic groups of pre-K level students who don't have their needs met? And what is the cost, the price of it for personal and societal on those levels?
Sure. So one of the key disparities is really just access to preschool. So, and this disparity occurs primarily based on family income. So children who are in families that are experiencing poverty are much less likely to be attending preschool. So just for background, about 18% of kids in the US reside in families experiencing poverty. And that means that their family income is below the federal poverty line, which for a family with 2 parents and 2 kids is about $26,000. So any families that earn above that are considered poor, and families that earn below that are considered poor. And what we see is that when we compare children in our highest earning families in this country, almost 25% more have access to preschool in the year before attending kindergarten than children in our lowest earning families. We also know that these gaps remain and might even be greater when we're comparing access to quality preschool. So preschool that we've measured and know is likely to meet those needs that I talked about in your first question. And this contributes to disparities that have lasting significance. So we know that children who experience quality preschool enter school more ready to learn. They have higher academic skills and are better able to transition into their kindergarten experiences. So from a personal level, it impacts kids' school readiness. And this school readiness these effects on school readiness translate into outcomes that sustain over time. So we know that early childhood access then leads to lifelong outcomes. So these experiments have been done that compare kids who had access to kids who don't, and they've shown tons of outcomes in adulthood, such as having better jobs, being less likely to commit crime, and even impacts on health. And when you look at this from a societal perspective, conservative estimates show that for every dollar that we spend as a society providing early childhood education, we're likely to reap at least $13 back in the system over the course of a person's life.
And when you hear that, it makes so much sense to invest in early childhood. And full disclosure for me, I was a nursery school, preschool teacher in a low income community when I first graduated from college. So I had the opportunity to see this firsthand. I have another question for you. What do you see the largest gaps in terms of needs not being met between young children, the age group we're talking about, of different races or different ethnicities?
Sure. So the access disparities that I just discussed related to poverty are also present when we think about race, ethnicity. But I also think it's important to note that even once children are in preschool classrooms, there are still different, there's disparities occurring. So we know that children of color are at greater risk of having less positive interactions with their teacher compared to white children in the classroom. Research has shown that teachers are more likely to have lower academic expectations for their children of color and are more likely to expect behavior problems for these children. And this is one example of implicit bias and how implicit bias may shape experiences that children are having. A really interesting study that was just done a few years ago exemplified this. Early childhood teachers were recruited and they watched videos of children and were told to look for challenging behaviors that the children were doing that they thought were likely to become problems. So trying to get at this early identification of problems. And the teachers wore eye tracking glasses, and they were then shown videos of children playing at a table in a preschool classroom. What the teachers didn't know was none of the children were actually showing challenging behaviors or problem behaviors. But when they went back and tracked where teachers were watching children and where they were spending their time, teachers were spending more time watching the African-American boy in the video than they were any of the other children. And because they controlled the behavior of the children, they know it wasn't actually related to that. And it was likely emerging from an implicit bias that teachers may hold. So that's something we really need to work on for the future. But I want to point out that this shapes these day-to-day interactions, but it also contributes to bigger issues. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but kids are more likely to be suspended or expelled in preschool than they are at any other grade in the educational system. And when we look at this by race ethnicity, we see that African-American children are 2.2 times more likely to be expelled than children of other race and ethnicity. And it's likely that these implicit biases are playing a substantial role in that.
Well, I did not know that statistic about preschool, and it's shocking. And I'm sure people who are listening to this webinar feel the same way. And the concern about implicit bias is so important. So one topic might be education. of the teachers working
Absolutely.
in preschool. I have one more question for you. Let's turn our attention to the pandemic. And how is the pandemic impacting educational systems, generally the at-risk groups of pre-K students in particular for the population that you're very aware of?
So the preschool system in our country is a fragile system already. Um, and the pandemic has really magnified some of the cracks that were already there. Preschool in our country is offered through a variety of sources. It's sometimes through school districts, it's sometimes through Head Start, but it's also often through privately run centers that really operate in the private sector. And so that has posed a lot of challenges both before COVID and after. Most directly, there's not enough money in the system to make it work. So preschool teachers make on average $13 an hour. They are often experiencing their own economic stress. They often aren't earning benefits. And this both impacts their ability to promote that positive environment in their classroom, but it also leads to a lot of teacher turnover because they look for other jobs that will pay them more, which leads kids to having inconsistencies in their environment, which undermines what it is that they need. That all was true before COVID. After COVID, the finances of maintaining quality preschool have become even harder. So like most businesses, many preschools in this country were shut down in March and April and perhaps for longer. And with reopening, they've had to accommodate new regulations for safety and health, such as having smaller sizes. And what's ended up happening is preschools are serving fewer students because of the regulations, but also because some parents are keeping their kids at home. But they've still had to do significant reorganizations, like building classrooms out in what used to be office space so that they can keep class sizes small. Preschool directors are also desperately trying to hold on to their teachers. And because of this, a recent survey of preschool programs across the country showed that the majority of programs are serving fewer students, but are also experiencing higher operating costs than they were before COVID. And in that same survey, 40% of preschool directors felt that they were at risk of having to shut down their program, depending on how the rest of this pandemic situation plays out. And as we see programs shutting down, what we're going to see is that those disparities in access that I talked about before are going to become magnified.
Thank you. Thank you. And, this is November 2020, and we're just beginning to see a surge, but maybe being optimistic about a vaccine in 2021. So maybe some of that can change some of what you're describing. And I think with advocacy, I hope that's a message that people are hearing as well.
Absolutely.
So thank you. Let's turn to the next age group. And Dr. Crump, I'm going to share with you a similar question that I just asked. At the grade school level, and maybe you can tell us what grade school age is, what are the top 2 to 3 greatest needs that a student has and that an educational system needs to provide to the students at that age? So thanks for addressing this question.
Thank you so much for that question, Karen. So I would like to just thank you, first of all, for allowing me to be a part of this panel. I want to first also just state what elementary age is. You are looking at students who are age 5 that go through age 11, 12. And then you're also looking at students who matriculate from a kindergarten to a 5th grade at the elementary age. Some like to also call it grade school. I mainly call it elementary. So when I look at that particular leveling of schooling, I see three different types of needs. One being students need strategic parent engagement, also good grounding wraparound services, as well as good quality teaching. So I'll first start off with parent engagement. And please note that I stated parent engagement, not parent involvement. I noted that for purpose of signifying that there is a distinct difference between these two words, between engagement and involvement. Involve implies doing to, and engagement means doing with. And when we think about the partnership that we are seeking with our parents, we want them to be able to come with and be able to develop plans together. So we definitely want the latter connection of working together with our parents. This will ensure buy-in where the school and the parent can work together for the common good of that child at hand. Now, this does not come natural. So we as school personnel really have to create the system that can make this work. One way that we can do it is through communication. You got to have open communication with your parents. You also have to have ways on how you can build relationships, not only with your administrative staff, but also with your teachers, your guidance counselors, your social workers, and everybody that's involved in that school system to be able to come together. The other thing is wraparound services. When we look at wraparound services, we know that we're bringing the community into our school. But when we bring the community into our school, we want to make sure that the community has a defined purpose. So wraparound services are designed to give the child the support that is needed throughout that school day, whether it be support in the academics, the social being, or the behavioral being of that student. So really, when you look at it, what separates wraparound services from support services is that it develops a comprehensive approach in providing those services. It's not a fragmented kind of Band-Aid that you give to be able to get at this particular issue and this concern. So everybody that's part of that system can come together and develop that particular plan. And so the third piece of it was quality teaching. And we all know that we want good qualified teachers in our classroom. Quality teachers are going to provide in that particular school setting good teaching. They're going to be able to develop structure, a set of rules, a set of routines that students will be able to go by. And it also will be able to create a conducive classroom for learning that can take place. Quality teachers specifically at the elementary level is very crucial to the core of a real, true, successful plight of students. There have been a ton of studies that have looked at how a student does at the elementary level as they matriculate through the school system. And looking at those elementary particular leveling, it can show how a student is successful later on in life. So good quality teachers, having good wraparound services, and also having good parent engagement are very key, specifically at the elementary level.
Thank you. And, you know, as the human factors and ergonomics field, that participation is so important. So when you emphasize parent engagement, it really resonated.
Definitely a
Thank
difference.
you. Here's another question. Are there demographic groups of elementary school age students who don't have their needs met? And similar question that I asked previously, what is the cost to the personal and societal levels?
So yes, unfortunately, when we look at the elementary level, we look at lower socioeconomic students, your poor students. You're also looking at your displaced students. And those displaced students are your foster, your homeless kind of students. And then of course, your students of color, which would be considered your Black and brown students. I would say that these are the particular demographics that suffer the most in not having their needs met. Now, please note that the demographics are not being stated to be considered one of the same, because you can definitely be poor and not be of color and have the same needs not being met, and vice versa. You can be of color and not be poor, but carry the same type of needs that are not being met. So when we look at the demographics of your socioeconomic, lower socioeconomic students, as well as your displaced students, we look at the needs of your food, your water, your clothing, shelter not being met. It goes back kind of to that Maslow hierarchy structure of needs that I know that all of us know about, where one cannot truly concentrate on learning something new that the teacher is trying to teach when they just have been awakened in a place of displacement with limited food, limited resources, limited clothing. And now they're being asked to be able to come to this school setting and be able to perform to their full potential. The other demographic that I had stated was the structure of, the students of color. For this, the basic simple fact that at this foundational stage of elementary school, there are still very limited role models or examples found in teachers that look like them. In fact, it was stated in an article that I read here recently that America's classrooms are becoming more diverse each year, with the expectation that America will actually become a majority minority population by 2044. And when we look at the teaching force at the elementary and the secondary levels, we still see that it is majority white and female. So you ask, well, how does this affect society? What it does, it leaves room for that implicit bias that Dr. Patel had mentioned. It also brings in a one-way perspective of how one looks at themselves in general. Despite a strong body of research that indicates that a diverse teaching staff can benefit not only Black and Brown students, but students of all races can really truly benefit from a diverse education staffing. And I think really at this particular age of elementary, that acceptance of those differences is really key because it really can begin the stages of acceptance of the diversity. So those are the particular things that I think are really key.
Well, they're so important. And it, again, I think a theme is advocacy here again. Making, wanting to be a teacher for this age group. It's so important. So I have another question for you. From your perspective, what are the top 3 factors or categories of factors that are most influential of student learning at this elementary school level? And you've shared some of those already, but perhaps you can go into a more depth into these.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the key things that I would say at this particular leveling of elementary is the most influential of student learning is really looking at curriculum standard and testing, as well as looking at your whole organization at your school setting, and as well as just looking at the full individual student. So when we look at the curriculum standards of testing, if we were going to say that good quality teaching must take place in our schools, then curriculum definitely has to be of good rigor, and high expectations must be set and must be included in that curriculum. We know that standards can give you the guide on what that curriculum must look like and what it must include. So the two go hand in hand. I personally used to be against testing, but over the years I have grown to see it and appreciate it. And you might as well say kind of tolerate it a little bit, I'll say, and knowing, but I now know that testing provides that basic baseline where a student stands academically at one point in time when they take that test, and then when they take the test again and being able to see the growth that they have made within that time period. So testing is good in this sense, and it's much needed in showing how effective student learning is actually taking place in our classrooms. And then when we look at school organization, in order for a school to function at its most opportune momentum of teaching and learning, it must have defined structured regulations that helps keep the momentum of that teaching and learning to occur. Rules, discipline, and having some concrete resolution processes in place, especially at that elementary level, are key to be able to give less interruption to the school setting. So it's very key that you have those foundations set within your school. The other piece was the individual student. When you look at the individual student, you're looking at the health, their nutrition, their socioeconomic status, the family involvement. And when we look at how this pandemic has happened, it has truly shined a light on the importance of how schooling in the elementary setting is so important. In my particular school district, and I'm sure across the nation, when the pandemic hit, the food did not stop. We provide food to students throughout the summer months. So we definitely couldn't stop it when that pandemic hit. We had to make sure that we all got together and ensure that our students can still be fed throughout this time period. So that was one thing. And then also looking at how computers and electronic devices are being used. And when you look at the full digital divide, so where many of our families do not have access to that high-speed internet connection and access. And then also looking at how schools have been able to provide the resources in the education, I'll say, and being able to provide to these families how COVID has affected us. Many of our school sites set up COVID kind of testing sites, as well as giving out that particular literature. So it's very crucial at this particular setting of elementary.
Yeah, you've touched upon so many important points. I have one last question, and you've answered most of it already, but maybe there's more that you'd like to add about where do you see the largest gaps and factors due to SES in terms of students' needs not being met. You mentioned some of them already with the internet, but and food insecurity. Are there others that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I would just say that, yes, of course, specifically in the areas of how you look at school funding too. Um, with, funding is based on a family's socioeconomic status, and it's based on that per student. So was just recently reading an article, and it quoted that the majority of non-white school districts receive an average of 23 billion less than predominantly white school districts, despite serving roughly the same number of students. So when you look at that, it basically translates to more than 2,200 less spent on each non-white student than on a white student counterpart per year. So this kind of solidifies a pattern of systemic, as I say, disenfranchisement from the moment that a child begins at the elementary level, which in essence sets these students up for failure, making it a little bit harder for them as they go through the matriculation of schooling. I mean, not to say that they can't succeed, because they can definitely succeed, but it just makes it a little bit harder. And then when you also look at the basic fact of the digital divide, 1 in 3 Black, Latino, or American Indian families do not have high-speed home internet and are more likely than white peers to be disconnected from online learning. So this gap is very critical. And specifically, there was a study done by Michigan State University that found that students who do not have home internet access, or who solely are dependent on their cell phone for that internet access, spend more time on their homework and have lower grade point averages and have a weaker digital skills. So, cell phones are great, but when you really think about it, you can't do your actual homework and all the things that the teachers are asking in that education setting. So it's very key.
Yeah, thank you. And then we add COVID to that.
Exactly.
And we see the disparities getting even larger.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Well, we're going to turn to our last panelist, who's going to take us now to the next school years. So Dr. Barrett, my first question is the same as I've asked previously. At the high school level, what are the top 2 to 3 greatest needs that a student has and that the educational system needs to provide for the students at that high school level? So welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jacobs. Let me say it's an honor to be a part of this esteemed panel today. I'm happy to be here. And it was really a difficult task for me to try to narrow down the top 3 educational needs of our high school students today. But when I thought about it, I would say it's going back to the basic ABCs that Dr. Patel and Dr. Crump talked about, academics, behavior, and character. But let me just reference that when we're talking high school, we are talking the traditional high school of grades 9 through 12. I know before the middle school movement, high school was 10 through 12, and then junior high was 7 through 9. But we are referring today about grades 9 through 12 after students have matriculated from the traditional middle school experience of grades 6 through 8. And I want to also say, I want to begin by acknowledging what our students currently have at this particular point in their academic journey, which is the opportunity to learn, which makes everything so beautiful. And the fact that certain students around the world are not given the opportunity that our students here in America currently have. So for that, we need to be grateful. And even though our students here in America are very blessed with the opportunities that we have, there are certain adjustments that I believe our educational system needs to make. So looking at our ABCs, let's start with number 1, academics at the high school level. We certainly need to focus on academic programs, as Dr. Crump mentioned, that are research-based and are solid, focused on outcomes that will be positive, should be priority number 1. Standards-based curriculum. And with that, we move into number 2, based on behavior, which behaviors, when I say that, we definitely need to take a clear look at guidance and positive behavior supports. So high schools really need to take a good look at the hiring of school guidance counselors and need to be sure that the individuals that they're hiring, they're providing effective information to our students today and providing them with information that's not going to only be good for them to use right now, but where they can use it in the future, and provide them with information so they're selecting the right majors for industries that are booming and bursting at the seams, and not selecting majors to major in college or career fields where they're not going to have a lucrative and successful future.
Mhm.
And also, thirdly, moving into the C of our ABCs, that would be learning the beauty of character and knowing what it means to succeed and to persevere, and having that sense of integrity. So when they're in the office place or when they're out and about in society, their character truly represents who they are and that they're knowledgeable. Because one of the things that we continuously see with our students that are having low self-esteem or suffering with anxiety and depression, especially now in the midst of COVID, where many of them are having to be isolated and not going through those traditional high school experiences that so many of them were looking forward to as they were matriculating through elementary and middle school, their graduations, their proms, their sporting activities, is the importance of self-love and the importance of having that self-confidence and the importance of how to communicate effectively with those around them, both in writing and verbally, and the importance of letting go of the past and focusing on the bright future that's possible in front of them. So we always hear kids talking about what has happened to them and not looking towards a positive future. Something else that is very critical that I believe should, and we hear this all the time, and we are making strides towards that, is the importance of incorporating financial literacy and credit and learning the benefits of home ownership and wealth management, especially when you're looking at your marginalized communities.
You know, I love that you frame this as the ABCs, which makes it so much easier to understand as we're going across the lifespan with children. Thank you. So I have another question, again, similar. Are there demographic groups of high school students who don't have their needs met? And what is the cost, both personal and societal?
Absolutely, Karen. You know, we've had these conversations for many, many years in education, and as much as things change, as much as they stay the same. So to that end, you know, oftentimes the marginalized groups always seem to get the short end of the stick. What I mean by that is, you know, your subgroups like your Hispanics, your Blacks, your low income students, students with disabilities, English language learners, oftentimes are the ones that get caught in the shuffle. it always tends to be a one size fits all approach where educators or school systems feel that they're going to use one curriculum with the same strategies and the same business as usual and expect to get these wonderful outcomes. Whereas in students in these particular subgroups would benefit from getting more of better out of an individual educational plan where with culturally relevant curriculum and individualized strategies and things that will meet them where they are on their educational journey. And the cost, I mean, when you have students that are falling behind, you have to remediate them. Thus Title I, thus students that are in the student with designation, designated as students with disability, you have more FTE dollars allocated towards students in those designations as opposed to students that are not designated students with disability. So you have many costs that are involved in funding in schools that are designated towards students in these subgroups if they're not addressed in the right way.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, this is building on what we've heard previously and also what you've shared. Do these gaps inevitably grow as children progress from childhood to adolescence? Or are there some successful stories or success stories of interventions that work to reduce gaps? And if you can share any of those with us, that would be great.
Most definitely, the gaps will grow if the interventions are not identified and addressed in a timely manner. For example, going back to the ABCs in academics, in third grade, standardized tests in reading are used to indicate future success in middle and high school, and even in some extreme cases, the school to prison pipeline. We heard early on in Dr. Patel's presentation about implicit bias and how early on students are often tapped as being misbehaved or not having the academic ability to achieve. So that goes into the B with the behavior. And a lot of times if they're tagged early on as being not able to achieve and being bad, that goes on with them throughout middle and high school. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the gap will widen. Character, as children grow, their character develops and it has the potential to go either direction. And with the lack of mentors and the lack of good intervention, you know, a student has the potential to either drop out or excel and go on into a great, career or college. So it's very important that the correct diagnosis or the correct interventions are put in place at a very young age or as early as possible, as soon as they're recognized, in order for the solutions to work for our students. And there are success stories, and there are also stories of students that were not identified and they've gone down the wrong path.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. So human factors and ergonomic theories value participatory design, and we've heard about some of that already. And in the design of systems in which people work, participatory design means that there's active involvement of the people who are served by or work in the system. And you've mentioned, everybody's mentioned some of that, to ensure that the design meets the needs. So my question to you, Dr. Barrett, is, does this match up with how educational systems or schools are designed, either generally or in specific case studies that you're aware? And why don't you answer that one first, and then I'll have a follow-up question to that.
Yes, absolutely. It does match up generally, and in many cases in the educational arena that I am aware of. In one case in particular, curriculum and instructional design is a very good example of participatory design.
Great. So I appreciate you saying that. And could you tell us about such a situation where you've experienced this and whether there were positive outcomes as a result of the involvement of the users in the design in this educational system?
Yes, absolutely. During my tenure at the Florida Department of Education, I served as the Florida Standards Implementation Director. And that was right at the time that we were in the state of Florida implementing the Common Core state standards and transitioning them to the now Florida standards, is what's currently being implemented here in our state. And throughout that process, we had to go through a modification process. And during that time, we sought stakeholder input from all across the state. And that included college professors, district administrators, teachers, parents, and even students. And the goal was to get as much stakeholder input as possible in order to make the right modifications to suit our students in Florida best, to make sure that we were meeting their educational needs and ensuring that we were providing with them with the best academic and educational standards that we felt suited them for our state. And it was met with some controversy. I mean, the feedback, we got mixed reviews, both positive and negative. However, as a state agency, we believe that we did our due diligence to include as many stakeholders in the process so that our students would be receiving what we believe was an education that would be held to the highest educational ideals.
Oh, thank you. And I'm sure that positive outcomes will happen because of that. So we have about 10 minutes. I don't see any questions posted yet. So let me ask a question of all of you, and anyone please answer. And Dr. Barrett, I want to thank you for bringing to the attention, as we were planning this panel discussion, a 2007 paper on educational ergonomics by Dr. Tom Smith, who is a HFES member. And he has two questions that are in this paper. And I'm going to say both of them and then I'll repeat them again. So you can answer the first or you can answer the second. The first question that he posed was, how can students and teachers be provided a broader control over different design factors known to influence learning performance? So that's the first question. Let me get the second one and then I'll repeat that first one again. And what design factors should be prioritized and targeted for control? And I'd like you to respond if these questions are still relevant in the pandemic, or are they even more relevant now during the pandemic? Does anybody want to answer that? It was a very stimulating article. And Dr. Barrett, thank you for bringing it to the attention for preparing for this panel.
Oh, you're welcome.
I can go first. I think that the pandemic has fundamentally changed the classroom system in early childhood, and I'm sure at other levels as well. And so I think about we need to find more design solutions for classrooms now during the pandemic. So we have early childhood classrooms where little kids are trying to socially distance from one another, which is very different from how they would experience preschool prior to the pandemic. We see children trying to learn language from teachers who are wearing masks. The whole classroom system has changed. And so the more we can think about what are optimal ways to design it under the current circumstances we're in, I think is really important. But I also think that optimistically, these vaccines come to play and we move back to some sort of normal in the coming year. The system is still going to look radically different. And I think it's in large part to the disparities that my co-panelists talked about. So what that is going to mean is teachers are going to have classrooms with kids that are all at their own individual level and are going to have a vast variety of needs. They're going to be at different points in their skill development. And we need to think about how we can support teachers to support these children as they're re-entering back into a normal schooling after having spent time either learning at home virtually or in some sort of hybrid setting or in one of these socially distanced classrooms.
Well, Dr. Patel, you made some really important points here. So we need resources to do that.
Yeah.
Really important. Anybody else want to share their thoughts about those questions?
I would say that it's not that it's more or less relevant at this point. It's just a matter of us reevaluating and reassessing in terms of the context that we're in now.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're coming to the conclusion of this webinar. We have a question that just got posted, and let me just read that to you. How can we help educators with improving learning from home ergonomic education that can be shared with parents for proper student workstation setup at home? And I do want to give a shout out that on the HFES website, hfes.org, we do have a handout for at home. So any thoughts about what we can do to help improve learning in the home environment? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have thoughts on that. One thing that I had mentioned was communication. When you look at the communication between your parent and your school setting, I know in my particular district, and actually at my school setting, I work in a school setting right now where it deals with students who have been expelled, as well as students who are academically behind at least 2 to 3 years. And so we have a real issue in communication. Like our teachers really try to reach out to those particular parents, but a lot of times they just don't respond. I mean, their phone numbers are off. Everything is not correct whenever we try to reach out. So we've tried different methods. Of course, we have a management type system district-wide that we use, and we send communication through that method. And many of them, when I seek out and speak to them, you know, are you part of the system? Have you set up your profile in it? And many of them have not. So that's not even one way of doing it. So being able to develop some type of communication tool, an app in some kind of way that can help with that communication tool. We've used a lot of different things. Remind, I know my daughter at her particular school, which I really loved, but of course there's a cost to that. So being able to find some type of dynamic in communication, I think is really key between your parent and your school setting.
Yeah, you make a really important point, and you know, one of you or all of you shared, you know, that we have parents that don't have internet at home. So some of that communication, you know, maybe they don't even have a telephone that's operational. You know, what can we do? Got a couple of questions, and let me read those to you. How can we address adverse childhood experiences through K through 12 without adding more work to our current workload? So let me repeat it again. How can we address adverse childhood experiences through K through 12 without adding more work to our current workload?
I'd like to take a stab at that.
Thank you.
I would say incorporating that through the C and the ABC, the character education piece. There are a lot of creative ways that can be incorporated through lessons, through activities, through online type platforms. There are a lot of creative ways that can be incorporated without feeling as though you're adding one more thing. Guest speakers, mentors, as I stated, online experiences, counseling. There are many ways that those things can be addressed for teachers to feel as though it is incorporated within their daily activities and not one more thing that they have to be responsible for.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm sure the teachers would appreciate that as well. We have one last question before we conclude our webinar, and let me read that. What can we as individuals who care about all children and education do to help level out the funding so that all students have equal access across the country? Wow, I've got my opinion on that one too. Anybody want to share a thought or two?
I I think it goes back to the point that you made earlier related to advocacy. And it's advocacy at all levels. So I'm in Ohio, and our state funding system for schools has been declared inequitable and face legal challenges for years. And our state legislature constantly tries to reform it, but never actually does. And so it's not just federal level advocacy, but thinking about how your state funds different districts and reaching out to your state representatives. Um, but one other thing that you can think about doing is one of the other mechanisms through which funding inequities persist is through parent-teacher organizations. And so we think we're doing a really great thing, donating to our children's school system, but what we're actually usually doing is helping the rich get richer while the poor stay where they're at, which is increasing the disparities. But there are a number of mechanisms that are emerging that can allow you to donate maybe across your state or across your region. Or you can take that on your own and say, well, for every dollar I give to this district, I'm going to give to this underfunded district nearby too. So it's an easy way where you can make a little bit of difference, especially in the face of not seeing the changes that we want to see at the system level.
Thank you. Well, we're going to conclude now. And that's a great point for ending the webinar. We all have a part to play in changing what we see and the disparities and to make it equal. So I want to thank you, Dr. Pertel, Dr. Crump, Dr. Barrett, for being with us today. I want to thank everybody who joined this webinar. This was so informative, and I hope that everyone leaves here feeling inspired and empowered to make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.